Sometimes the most powerful people walk among us in plain sight, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying themselves like anyone else. They blend into crowds, sit in coffee shops, and ride public transportation just like the rest of us. But what happens when someone mistakes their humility for weakness? What happens when a person's arrogance blinds them to the truth standing right in front of them? This is the story of a moment that changed everything. A single encounter that would expose the dangerous game of judging people by their appearance. It's about a woman who chose to hide her true identity, and a man whose cruelty would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. In a world where respect is often measured by uniforms and titles, sometimes the most important lesson comes from the person you least expect. This is that story, raw, real, and absolutely true. The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base parking lot as Sarah Martinez pulled her old Honda into a visitor spot. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, adjusting the simple black blazer she wore over dark jeans. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a modest ponytail, and she carried only a small leather purse and a folder containing the documents she needed for today's meeting. To anyone watching, she looked like countless other civilian contractors, government workers, or family members who visited the base daily. There was nothing about her appearance that would suggest she held one of the most powerful positions in the entire naval command structure. That was exactly how she preferred it. Admiral Sarah Martinez had spent 23 years climbing the ranks of the United States Navy. She had commanded ships in 3 different oceans, led peacekeeping missions in troubled waters, and earned the respect of sailors and officers across the globe. At 45, she was one of the youngest admirals in naval history and commanded a fleet of over 30 vessels. But today, she wasn't here as an admiral. She was here as herself. A woman who believed that the best way to understand the people under her command was to occasionally walk among them without the weight of rank and ceremony. The base security checkpoint buzzed with its usual morning activity. Sailors in crisp uniforms moved through the lines with practiced efficiency, their IDs ready, their posture reflecting years of military discipline. Sarah joined the civilian line, watching the familiar dance of military life unfold around her. She had requested this unannounced visit to review the base's new training facilities, but she had specifically asked to do so without the usual fanfare that accompanied an admiral's inspection. Next, called out the guard at the civilian checkpoint. Sarah stepped forward and handed over her ID. The young petty officer barely glanced at it before waving her through. She made her way toward the main administration building, her steps unhurried and her demeanor calm. The hallways of the administration building hummed with activity. Junior officers hurried past with armfuls of paperwork, their conversations filled with the technical jargon and casual complaints that were the soundtrack of military life everywhere. Sarah observed it all with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in these environments, noting the efficiency of operations and the morale of the personnel. She was approaching the elevator when she heard the voice, loud, condescending, and filled with an arrogance that made her pause. "I don't care what your little forms say, lady. This is a restricted area, and you clearly don't belong here." Sarah turned toward the source of the commotion and saw a scene that immediately set her on edge. Near the reception desk, a tall man in a lieutenant commander's uniform stood with his hands on his hips, towering over a small, elderly woman who clutched a manila envelope to her chest. The woman, who appeared to be in her 70s, wore a simple floral dress and carried herself with the dignity of someone who had seen decades of life's challenges. "Sir, I have an appointment," the elderly woman said, her voice steady despite the obvious intimidation tactics being employed against her. "My grandson serves on the USS Bellingham, and I was told to bring these documents to the personnel office." The lieutenant commander, his nameplate read Henderson, let out a theatrical sigh that was clearly meant to be heard by everyone in the vicinity. Several other personnel had stopped their activities to watch the exchange, some looking uncomfortable, others appearing entertained by the spectacle. Listen, Grandma, Henderson said, his voice dripping with condescension. I don't know who told you that you could just wander around a military installation, but this isn't a tourist attraction. These are serious facilities for serious people who understand serious business. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. In all her years of service, she had seen many examples of officers who used their rank to bully and intimidate those they perceived as powerless. It was a behavior she despised, and one she had worked tirelessly to eliminate from the commands under her authority. The elderly woman straightened her shoulders, a gesture that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother's quiet strength in the face of adversity. Young man, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I followed the proper procedures, and I have every right to be here. Henderson's face flushed red, and his voice rose another notch. Right? You want to talk about rights? Let me explain something to you about how things work around here. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I've earned my position through years of dedicated service, and I don't appreciate having my authority questioned by some random civilian who probably doesn't even understand what we do here. The woman's companion, a middle-aged man who appeared to be her son, stepped forward nervously. Please, officer, we're just trying to get some paperwork processed for her grandson. We were told to come here. And I'm telling you that you're in the wrong place, Henderson snapped. This is what happens when people don't follow proper channels. You civilians think you can just show up anywhere and demand service like this is some kind of department store. Sarah watched as several junior officers and enlisted personnel gathered around, some recording the encounter with their phones. She could see the mix of emotions on their faces. Some looked disgusted by Henderson's behavior, while others seemed to find entertainment in watching a superior officer assert his dominance over helpless civilians. Furthermore, Henderson continued, his voice now carrying across the entire reception area, I'm getting tired of dealing with people who think that just because they have some connection to the military, they deserve special treatment. This woman probably doesn't even really have a grandson in the Navy. These people make up stories all the time to try to get access to places they don't belong. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah saw the elderly woman's face crumple slightly, not from fear, but from the deep hurt that comes from having your integrity questioned by someone in authority. It was a look Sarah had seen too many times in her career, the expression of someone who had approached the system with trust and respect, only to be met with cruelty and suspicion. I have his deployment papers right here, the woman said quietly, opening her envelope and beginning to pull out official documents. His name is Petty Officer 3rd Class Michael Chun, and he's my grandson. Henderson didn't even look at the papers. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively. Anyone can get fake documents printed these days. What I see is an old woman who doesn't understand boundaries, and a story that probably changes every time she tells it. The gathered crowd was growing larger now, and Sarah noticed that some of the junior officers were looking increasingly uncomfortable with their superior's behavior. She also noticed that several sailors were quietly shaking their heads in disapproval. Henderson, however, seemed to be feeding off the attention, his voice growing louder and more theatrical with each sentence. You know what your problem is? Henderson continued, pointing a finger at the elderly woman. Your generation thinks the world owes you something just because you're old. Well, let me tell you something. Age doesn't automatically equal wisdom, and it certainly doesn't equal the right to waste the valuable time of busy military personnel. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen enough. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior. It was a fundamental violation of everything the military was supposed to represent. Honor, respect, and service were not just words printed on motivational posters. They were supposed to be the living principles that guided every interaction, especially with the families of service members. The elderly woman's son was growing more agitated, his face reddening as he watched his mother being humiliated in public. This is completely unnecessary, he said, his voice shaking with controlled anger. She's just trying to help her grandson. Oh, now we have the cavalry arriving, Henderson said with a cruel laugh. Let me guess, you gonna tell me all about your rights too? Maybe threaten to call your congressman? That's always the next step with people like you. The situation was escalating, and Sarah could see that it was on the verge of becoming something much worse than a simple misunderstanding. Henderson was clearly enjoying his position of power, and the presence of an audience was only encouraging him to push further. She had seen this pattern before. Officers who had never learned to separate authority from abuse, who confused respect for rank with license to humiliate others. "Sir," one of the junior officers finally spoke up, a young ensign whose discomfort was written clearly across his face. "Maybe we should just help them find the right office?" Henderson whirled around to face the ensign, his expression instantly shifting from theatrical superiority to genuine anger. "Ensign Rodriguez, did I ask for your opinion? Because the last time I checked, I outrank you by a considerable margin, and when I want your input, I'll specifically request it." The ensign immediately stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. Sarah watched the interaction with growing disgust. Henderson wasn't just bullying civilians now. He was using his rank to silence junior officers who were trying to do the right thing. As a matter of fact, Henderson continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge, "I think this is a perfect teaching moment for everyone here. Watch and learn how to handle situations like this. The military operates on discipline and hierarchy. When civilians don't respect that hierarchy, it's our job to educate them about how things work in the real world." He turned back to the elderly woman, who was now visibly shaking, though whether from fear or anger, Sarah couldn't tell. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your little folder and your made-up stories, and you're going to leave this facility immediately. If you refuse, I'll have security escort you out. And if you try to come back, I'll make sure your name is flagged as a potential security risk." The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that several people in the crowd audibly gasped. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. She had heard enough. More than enough. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior. It was a complete abandonment of the values that every person in uniform was sworn to uphold. But before she could act, the elderly woman surprised everyone by straightening to her full height and looking Henderson directly in the eye. "Young man," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I've lived through wars, recessions, and decades of people who thought they could intimidate me because of my age or appearance. My husband served in Korea, my son served in Desert Storm, and my grandson is currently serving his country with more honor than you've shown in this entire conversation." Henderson's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, so now we're getting the whole family history? How touching. But here's a news flash, Grandma. Nobody cares about your family service record. What matters is the here and now. And right now, you're trespassing on a military installation." "I am not trespassing," the woman replied firmly. "I have proper documentation, I follow proper procedures, and I have every right to be here." "Rights again." Henderson laughed, turning to address his audience. "Isn't it amazing how quickly civilians start talking about their rights when they get called out for inappropriate behavior? Let me explain something about rights, lady. Rights are earned, not given. And you haven't earned the right to waste our time with your problems." Sarah had heard enough. She began walking toward the group, her steps measured and purposeful. As she moved, she noticed several things that Henderson, in his arrogant display, had completely missed. The junior officers weren't looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with disgust. The enlisted personnel weren't impressed by his authority. They were embarrassed by his behavior. And the elderly woman he was humiliating wasn't backing down. She was getting stronger with every word he spoke. Furthermore, Henderson continued, completely oblivious to the changing dynamics around him, "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about security protocols around here. We can't just let any random person walk in here claiming to have family in the service. Next thing you know, we'll have every lonely old person in the city showing up here, looking for attention." The cruelty of the comment sent a wave of shocked silence through the crowd. Even some of Henderson's supporters seemed taken aback by the viciousness of the attack. But Henderson, feeding off what he mistook for approval, pressed on. The truth is, people like this are a security risk. They don't understand protocol, they don't respect authority, and they think their personal problems should be everyone else's emergency. Well, I've got news for you. The United States Navy doesn't exist to provide therapy sessions for confused senior citizens. Sarah was close now, close enough to see the tears of frustration in the elderly woman's eyes, close enough to hear the sharp intake of breath from the watching personnel, close enough to see that Henderson was completely lost in his own performance of power and cruelty. You know what I think? Henderson said, his voice reaching its crescendo. I think this whole story about having a grandson in the Navy is just a fabrication designed to get attention. I think we're dealing with someone who's probably suffering from age-related confusion and shouldn't be allowed to wander around unsupervised. That was the moment Sarah Martinez decided that Lieutenant Commander Henderson was about to receive an education he would never forget. Sarah Martinez stepped into the circle that had formed around the confrontation, her movements so quiet and natural that most people didn't immediately notice her presence. She positioned herself slightly behind and to the left of Henderson, close enough to hear every word but far enough away to observe the entire scene. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from years of command experience. The tone was polite but firm, cutting through Henderson's theatrical performance like a knife through paper. Henderson turned around, his expression showing irritation at being interrupted during what he clearly considered to be his moment of triumph. When he saw Sarah, a woman in civilian clothes with no visible rank or authority, his expression shifted to one of barely contained contempt. "And you are?" Henderson asked, his voice dripping with the same condescension he had been showing the elderly woman. "Because if you're another family member here to complain about proper security procedures, you can save us all some time and just leave now." Sarah looked at him steadily, her expression neutral. "I'm someone who's been watching this conversation with great interest. I'm curious about your approach to customer service." Henderson let out a bark of laughter. "Customer service? Lady, this isn't a shopping mall. This is a United States military installation, and we don't provide customer service to random civilians who wander in here with their problems." "I see," Sarah replied calmly. "So your position is that military facilities should not provide service to the families of active service members?" "My position," Henderson said, his voice rising again as he sensed another opportunity to demonstrate his authority, "is that people need to follow proper procedures and show proper respect for the chain of command. What we have here is a failure to understand how military operations work." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Could you explain to me what proper procedures this lady failed to follow? Because from what I observed, she presented identification, explained her purpose, and provided documentation." Henderson's eyes narrowed. He was clearly not used to having his actions questioned, especially by someone he perceived as having no authority to do so. "Who exactly are you to be asking these questions? Because unless you have some kind of official capacity here, I don't owe you any explanations." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed. "You don't owe me anything. But I'm curious about something. Do you believe that the way you've handled this situation reflects well on the Navy?" The question hit Henderson like a physical blow. Several of the watching personnel shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah could see that her words had struck at the heart of something that even Henderson couldn't entirely dismiss. Military pride ran deep, and questioning whether someone's actions honored the service was a serious challenge. "How I handle security situations is based on years of experience and proper training," Henderson replied, but there was a defensive edge to his voice now. "Civilian contractors and random visitors don't get to question military procedures just because they don't like the outcomes." "Civilian contractors?" Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you think I am?" "I think you're someone who doesn't belong in this conversation," Henderson snapped. "And if you keep interfering with official business, you're going to find yourself escorted off the premises just like your friend here." The elderly woman, who had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, suddenly spoke up. "Miss, you don't need to get involved in this. I don't want you to get in trouble because of my problems." Sarah turned to the older woman and smiled warmly. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Dorothy Chun," the woman replied. "And this is my son, Robert." "Mrs. Chun, it's a pleasure to meet you. Could you tell me about your grandson?" Dorothy's face immediately brightened, the stress and fear of the previous confrontation melting away as she talked about her family. "Michael is 22 years old, and he's been in the Navy for 3 years. He's currently deployed on the USS Bellingham, serving as a communications specialist. He's such a good boy, always been responsible, always been respectful of others." Unlike his grandmother, apparently, Henderson muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah's expression didn't change, but several people in the crowd winced at the comment. She continued speaking to Dorothy as if Henderson hadn't spoken at all. "What kind of paperwork were you trying to process today?" "Michael asked me to update his emergency contact information," Dorothy explained, pulling documents from her envelope. "His father, my son Robert here, moved recently, and Michael wanted to make sure the Navy had the correct address in case anything happened." Sarah examined the paperwork Dorothy handed her. The documents were clearly official Navy forms, properly filled out and signed. Michael Chin's service record showed commendations for excellent performance and leadership potential. Everything was exactly as Dorothy had represented it. "These appear to be in perfect order," Sarah said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Standard Form 93, properly completed and notarized. This is exactly the kind of paperwork that should be processed through the personnel office." Henderson had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange. The woman in civilian clothes was not only continuing to interfere with his authority, but she was also demonstrating a knowledge of military procedures that suggested she wasn't just some random visitor. "Okay, that's enough," Henderson declared. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're way out of line here. You're interfering with official business, you're questioning a superior officer's decisions, and you're causing a disruption in a secure facility." He stepped closer to Sarah, using his height and uniform to try to intimidate her. It was a tactic that had probably worked for him many times before, the combination of rank, physical presence, and institutional authority that could make most civilians back down immediately. Sarah didn't move. She looked up at Henderson with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the conversation. "A superior officer?" she repeated quietly. "Superior to whom?" "Superior to you, obviously," Henderson replied, his voice filled with triumphant confidence. "I'm Lieutenant Commander James Henderson, and I have 15 years of military service. I think that gives me a bit more authority in this situation than some random woman who wandered in off the street." 15 years, Sarah mused. "That's quite impressive. Could you tell me about your current assignment?" Henderson's chest puffed out with pride. "I'm the Assistant Personnel Operations Officer for this command. I'm responsible for overseeing civilian interactions and ensuring that security protocols are properly maintained. And in that capacity," Sarah continued, "you determined that Mrs. Chin's legitimate request for administrative services should be denied. I determined that her attitude and approach were inappropriate for a military facility," Henderson replied firmly. "Part of maintaining proper security is ensuring that people understand and respect military culture." Sarah nodded slowly. "I see. So you believe that humiliating an elderly woman in public, questioning her integrity, and threatening to have her arrested demonstrates proper military culture?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Several of the junior officers were now watching the exchange with obvious fascination, and Sarah could see recognition dawning in some of their eyes. They were beginning to realize that this seemingly ordinary civilian woman was asking the kinds of questions and demonstrating the kind of knowledge that suggested she wasn't what she appeared to be. Henderson, however, was too caught up in his own performance to notice the changing atmosphere. What demonstrates proper military culture is maintaining discipline and ensuring that people follow proper channels. What we don't need is bleeding heart civilians coming in here and trying to turn a military installation into a social services office. "Interesting perspective," Sarah replied. "Tell me, Lieutenant Commander Henderson, what do you know about the Navy's core values?" The question seemed to catch Henderson off guard. What kind of question is that? Honor, courage, commitment, Sarah said quietly. Those are the 3 core values that every sailor is supposed to embody. Could you explain to me how your treatment of Mrs. Chun reflects those values? Henderson's face was growing redder by the minute. Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but you're way out of your depth. You can't just walk into a military facility and start lecturing people about Navy values. You don't have the background, the training, or the authority to question how military personnel perform their duties. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. I don't have the right to question military personnel, but I do have the right to question my own personnel. The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of realization through the watching crowd. Henderson stared at her, his mouth slightly open, as the implications of what she had just said began to sink in. Your personnel? He repeated slowly. Sarah reached in her purse and pulled out a leather wallet. She flipped it open to reveal her military identification card, holding it so that Henderson and several of the nearby personnel could see it clearly. Admiral Sarah Martinez, she said quietly. Commander, 3rd Fleet. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every person in uniform within sight immediately snapped to attention, their faces showing various degrees of shock, embarrassment, and in Henderson's case, absolute terror. The junior officers who had been uncomfortable with Henderson's behavior now looked vindicated, while those who had been enjoying the show suddenly found themselves wishing they were anywhere else in the world. Henderson's face went through a remarkable transformation, cycling from red to white to green in the space of a few seconds. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He was staring at the ID card as if it might somehow change if he looked at it long enough. Admiral, he finally managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Commander Henderson, Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the same calm tone she had used throughout the conversation. I believe you were in the middle of explaining to Mrs. Chun why her legitimate request for administrative services was being denied. The silence in the room was so complete that Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Every eye was fixed on Henderson, who was now swaying slightly on his feet as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. Admiral, I wasn't. Henderson's voice trailed off as he realized that nothing he could say would possibly make this situation better. Sarah looked around at the gathered personnel, her gaze taking in each face. When she spoke, her voice was still quiet, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded thousands of sailors across multiple theaters of operation. I want everyone here to understand something very clearly, she said. What we witnessed today was not military culture. It was not proper protocol. It was not an example of Navy values in action. What we witnessed was a complete failure of leadership, integrity, and basic human decency. Henderson opened his mouth as if to speak, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping him. I'm not finished, she said, and the steel in her voice made it clear that she was speaking now not as the civilian observer she had pretended to be, but as an admiral addressing her command. Mrs. Chun came to this facility with a legitimate request, proper documentation, and a respectful attitude. She was seeking assistance with administrative matters related to her grandson's service. Instead of receiving the professional service she deserved, she was subjected to humiliation, intimidation, and accusations of dishonesty. Sarah turned to look directly at Henderson, who was now visibly trembling. Lieutenant Commander Henderson, your behavior today has violated every principle that the United States Navy stands for. You have disgraced your uniform, dishonored your service, and demonstrated that you are fundamentally unfit for any position involving interaction with the public. The words hit Henderson like physical blows. He tried to speak, his mouth working soundlessly, but Sarah wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, your treatment of Ensign Rodriguez when he attempted to provide appropriate guidance shows that your problems extend beyond civilian relations. You use your rank not to provide leadership, but to silence junior officers who are trying to do the right thing. That's not command authority. That's abuse of power. Sarah looked around at the crowd again, making eye contact with several of the junior officers. I want everyone here to remember what you've seen today. This is what happens when we forget that we serve the people, not the other way around. This is what happens when we confuse authority with arrogance, when we mistake rank for righteousness. She turned back to Henderson one final time. Lieutenant Commander, you will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. We will be having a very detailed discussion about your future in the United States Navy. Henderson managed a weak, yes, ma'am, but his voice was barely audible. Sarah then turned to Dorothy Chun, her expression softening completely. Mrs. Chun, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. This is not representative of the Navy's values or the respect we have for military families. Dorothy, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, found her voice. Admiral, you didn't need to do that. But thank you. Yes, I didn't need to do that, Sarah replied firmly. Your grandson is serving his country with honor, and you deserve to be treated with the same respect we would show him. Now, let's get your paperwork processed properly. Within minutes of Admiral Martinez revealing her identity, the entire atmosphere of the administration building had transformed. Word spread through the facility like wildfire, carried by text messages, phone calls, and hurried conversations in hallways. Personnel who had been going about their routine duties suddenly found themselves part of a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Ensign Rodriguez, who had tried to intervene earlier, approached the group with obvious nervousness. Admiral, ma'am, if I may, is there anything I can do to assist Mrs. Chun with her paperwork? Sarah smiled at the young officer, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her that morning. Ensign Rodriguez, I appreciate your initiative earlier. Yes, please escort Mrs. Chun and her son to the personnel office and ensure that her request is processed immediately and correctly. Yes, ma'am, Rodriguez replied, his relief evident. He turned to Dorothy with a respectful nod. Mrs. Chun, if you would please follow me, I'll make sure everything is taken care of properly. As Dorothy and her son were led away, Sarah noticed that Henderson was still standing frozen in place, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with personnel from other offices arriving to witness the aftermath of what was already being called the Henderson incident. Lieutenant Commander Henderson, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the whispered conversations around them. I believe I gave you instructions about reporting to my office tomorrow morning. Henderson snapped out of his trance-like state. Yes, Admiral. 0800 hours. I'll be there. See that you are, Sarah replied. And Henderson, yes, ma'am. I suggest you spend the rest of today thinking very carefully about whether you want to continue wearing that uniform. The implications of her words were clear to everyone present. Henderson's naval career was hanging by a thread, and everyone knew it. He managed a weak salute before hurrying away from the scene, his shoulders hunched and his confident demeanor completely shattered. As Henderson disappeared around the corner, Sarah turned her attention to the remaining personnel. Many of them were junior officers and enlisted sailors who had witnessed the entire confrontation, and she could see a mixture of emotions on their faces: admiration, embarrassment, curiosity, and in some cases, fear. I want to address something with all of you, Sarah said, her voice carrying easily through the space. What happened here today was not entertainment. It was not a show put on for your amusement. It was a fundamental failure of military values, and everyone who stood by and watched without intervening shares some responsibility for what occurred. The words hit the gathered personnel like a splash of cold water. Several of them looked down at their feet, while others shifted uncomfortably. Sarah continued, her tone firm but not harsh. I understand that rank and hierarchy are important in military operations. I understand that challenging a superior officer can be difficult and potentially career-damaging. But there are times when doing the right thing requires courage, even when that courage might cost you something. She made eye contact with several of the junior officers as she spoke. Ensign Rodriguez showed that courage today. He saw something wrong happening and tried to intervene, even though it meant challenging a senior officer. That's the kind of moral courage that the Navy needs from all of its personnel. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a 20-year veteran who had been among the watching crowd, stepped forward. "Admiral, ma'am, with respect, most of us knew what Henderson was doing was wrong, but we weren't sure how to handle it without making things worse." Sarah nodded, appreciating the honesty. "Chief Williams, that's exactly the kind of situation where leadership training and moral courage become critical. When you see someone abusing their authority, especially against civilians or family members of service personnel, you have a duty to act." She looked around at the group again. "I'm not talking about mutiny or insubordination. I'm talking about finding appropriate ways to de-escalate situations, to provide proper assistance, and to ensure that people are treated with dignity and respect. Sometimes that means speaking up. Sometimes it means finding a senior officer who can intervene. Sometimes it means simply treating people better than the example you're seeing from your superiors." Petty Officer First Class Johnson, who had been recording parts of the confrontation on his phone, raised his hand nervously. "Admiral, should we not have been filming what was happening?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Petty Officer Johnson, transparency and accountability are important values. If you were recording Henderson's behavior because you were concerned about the treatment Mrs. Chun was receiving, then you showed good judgment. Documentation can be important when investigating misconduct. She paused, then added, "However, I want to be very clear about something. The fact that this incident was recorded and will probably be shared widely means that the Navy's reputation is now on the line. People will see how we handled this situation, and they will judge all of us based on what they see." The weight of her words settled over the group. They were no longer just witnesses to an unfortunate incident. They were now representatives of the entire military in the court of public opinion. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a personnel officer who had arrived late to the scene, stepped forward. "Admiral, what can we do to prevent situations like this from happening in the future?" "Excellent question, Lieutenant Kim," Sarah replied. "First, we need better training for all personnel who interact with military families and civilians. Customer service and, yes, Lieutenant Commander Henderson, it is customer service should be a core component of military professionalism." She began pacing slightly as she spoke, her command presence evident in every gesture. "Second, we need to create an environment where junior personnel feel empowered to speak up when they see inappropriate behavior. That means protecting people who report misconduct and ensuring that doing the right thing doesn't result in retaliation." Chief Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, in my experience, a lot of these problems come from officers who get promoted to positions of authority, but never learn how to actually lead people." "You're absolutely right, Chief," Sarah agreed. "Military leadership isn't just about giving orders and expecting compliance. It's about serving the people under your command, serving the mission, and serving the values that the military represents. When leaders forget that they're servants first and authorities second, we get situations like what happened here today." As the conversation continued, Sarah noticed that a small crowd of civilian workers and contractors had gathered at the edges of the group. Many of them looked nervous, as if they were unsure whether they should be listening to military personnel discussing internal matters. "Excuse me," Sarah called out to them. "Please don't leave. I want you to hear this too." A middle-aged woman who appeared to be a civilian contractor stepped forward hesitantly. "Admiral, we don't want to intrude on military business." "You're not intruding," Sarah assured her. "You're part of this community, and what happened here today affects you as well. Mrs. Chun could have been any one of you, and the way she was treated reflects on all of us who work on this base." She addressed the mixed group of military and civilian personnel. "I want everyone to understand that respect and professionalism are not dependent on rank or uniform. Every person who comes to this facility, whether they're active duty, retired, civilian employees, or family members, deserves to be treated with dignity." The civilian contractor found her courage. "Admiral, we really appreciate you saying that. Sometimes it can be intimidating to come here for meetings or to process paperwork, especially when you encounter personnel who seem to view civilians as inconveniences. What's your name? Sarah asked. Janet Rodriguez, the woman replied. I work for a company that provides IT services to the base. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. Are you related to Ensign Rodriguez? He's my nephew, Janet replied with obvious pride. I was so proud of him for speaking up today. His family raised him to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Well, Mrs. Rodriguez, your nephew represents the best of what the Navy can be, Sarah said. And you should know that his actions today probably prevented this situation from becoming much worse than it already was. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed that several personnel were approaching her individually, apparently wanting to speak privately. She spent the next hour listening to stories, concerns, and observations about the base's operations. What she heard painted a picture of an installation where Henderson's behavior was not entirely unusual, though it was perhaps more extreme than normal. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, the base personnel officer, approached Sarah with obvious anxiety. Admiral, I need to apologize. Henderson reports to me, and I should have been aware of these issues. Sarah studied the younger officer carefully. Commander Hayes, what did you know about Henderson's approach to civilian interactions? Hayes looked uncomfortable. I knew he could be brusque with people, but I thought it was just a matter of him being very focused on security protocols. I didn't realize he was actively hostile to family members seeking legitimate services. When was the last time you personally observed Henderson interacting with civilians? Sarah asked. To be honest, Admiral, I mostly hear about interactions secondhand. I spend most of my time in meetings or working on administrative issues. Sarah nodded. That's part of the problem, Commander. Leadership requires direct observation, not just reports from subordinates. How can you evaluate someone's performance if you don't see them actually performing their duties? The criticism was delivered gently, but its impact was clear. Hayes straightened her shoulders. You're absolutely right, ma'am. I need to be more hands-on in my supervision. Good, Sarah replied. I want you to develop a plan for improving civilian services on this base. That includes training for all personnel who interact with the public, regular monitoring of service quality, and a feedback system that allows people to report problems without fear of retaliation. As Sarah continued her impromptu inspection of the base's operations, word of the morning's events continued to spread. By lunchtime, the story had reached social media, where several versions of the encounter were being shared and discussed. The video footage captured by Petty Officer Johnson had been edited and posted online, showing Henderson's cruel treatment of Dorothy Chun and Sarah's eventual intervention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Military families, veterans, and civilian supporters flooded social media with comments praising Sarah's actions and condemning Henderson's behavior. The hashtag Admiral in Disguise began trending, with people sharing their own stories of positive and negative interactions with military personnel. Sarah was in the base commander's office, reviewing the preliminary reports about the incident, when her aide knocked on the door. Admiral, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're receiving a lot of media attention. The story about this morning is spreading rapidly online. Sarah sighed. She had hoped to handle the situation quietly, but she had known that the presence of cameras and the dramatic nature of the confrontation would likely make that impossible. What kind of coverage are we getting? She asked. Mostly positive, ma'am. People are praising your handling of the situation and calling for more accountability in military leadership. However, there are some commentators who are questioning whether your approach was appropriate. Sarah considered this. Were they saying, some people are suggesting that you should have identified yourself immediately instead of letting the situation escalate. Others are saying that publicly humiliating Henderson was unprofessional. And what do you think? Sarah asked her aide. Ma'am, I think you demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that the military needs. You showed that no one is above accountability, and you stood up for someone who couldn't defend herself. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The reality is that if I had identified myself immediately, Henderson would have changed his behavior, but he wouldn't have learned anything. Mrs. Chun would have received proper service, but only because an admiral was watching. That's not the kind of culture we want to create. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where hundreds of sailors are going about their daily duties. Military leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear or rank. It's about earning respect through service, integrity, and accountability. What happened this morning was a teaching moment, not just for Henderson, but for everyone who witnessed it. Her aide nodded. Admiral, there's something else you should know. Mrs. Chun has been receiving messages of support from military families all over the country. Her story seems to have resonated with people who have had similar experiences. That's both encouraging and concerning, Sarah replied. Encouraging because it shows that most people recognize inappropriate behavior when they see it. Concerning because it suggests that Mrs. Chin's experience may not be as unusual as we would like to think. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah received calls from senior military officials, media representatives, and advocacy groups. The consensus seemed to be that her actions had been appropriate and necessary, but there were also concerns about the broader implications of the incident. Admiral Thomas Burke, Sarah's immediate superior, called to discuss the situation. Sarah, I want you to know that you have my full support in how you handled this morning's events. However, we need to think carefully about how we move forward. I agree, Tom, Sarah replied. This incident has highlighted some systematic problems that we need to address across the entire command structure. What are you thinking? Burke asked. I want to implement a comprehensive review of civilian services across all installations under my command. We need to establish clear standards, provide proper training, and create accountability mechanisms that prevent situations like this from occurring. Burke was quiet for a moment. That's a significant undertaking, Sarah. It will require resources and personnel that we might not have available. The alternative is continuing to have incidents like this one, Sarah replied firmly. Every time we fail to properly serve military families or treat civilians with respect, we damage our reputation and undermine public support for our mission. You're right, Burke agreed. Put together a proposal and we'll find the resources to make it happen. As evening approached, Sarah prepared to leave the base. She had spent the entire day dealing with the aftermath of the Henderson incident, but she felt that it had been time well spent. The conversation she had had with personnel at all levels had given her valuable insights into the culture and operations of the installation. Before leaving, she stopped by the personnel office to check on Mrs. Chen's paperwork. Ensign Rodriguez was still on duty, and he immediately stood when she entered. Admiral, Mrs. Chen's emergency contact information has been updated and processed. Everything should be reflected in her grandson's service record within 24 hours. Excellent work. Ensign, Sarah replied. How did Mrs. Chen seem when she left? She was very gracious, ma'am. She asked me to thank you again for your intervention. She also said something interesting. What was that? She said that her grandson would be proud to know that there are leaders like you looking out for military families. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Ensign Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen's grandson, should be proud of her as well. She showed remarkable courage and dignity under very difficult circumstances. As Sarah finally left the base that evening, she reflected on the events of the day. The Henderson incident had been unfortunate and embarrassing, but it had also provided an opportunity to address larger issues and to demonstrate the Navy's commitment to its core values. She knew that Henderson's career was likely over. The behavior she had witnessed was so far outside the bounds of acceptable conduct that there was really no path to redemption. But she also hoped that other personnel had learned from watching the consequences of his actions. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her office early to prepare for her meeting with Henderson. She had spent considerable time thinking about what she wanted to accomplish in their conversation. Her goal was not simply to punish him, but to understand how a 15-year veteran could have developed such a fundamental misunderstanding of military values. At exactly 0800 hours, Henderson knocked on her office door. When she called for him to enter, she was struck by how different he appeared from the confident, arrogant officer who had been tormenting Mrs. Chun just 24 hours earlier. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and his posture was correct, but his face showed the strain of a sleepless night and the weight of impending consequences. "Lieutenant Commander Henderson reporting as ordered, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sit down, Henderson," Sarah replied, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. For the next hour, Sarah conducted what would be Henderson's final performance evaluation. What she discovered was a man who had gradually lost sight of why he had joined the military in the first place. Someone who had allowed years of bureaucratic frustrations and personal disappointments to corrupt his sense of purpose. By the end of their conversation, Henderson had agreed to submit his resignation from active duty. Sarah believed it was the best outcome for everyone involved. Henderson could leave with some dignity intact, and the Navy could move forward without the liability of having an officer who had demonstrated such poor judgment in a position of authority. The story of Admiral Martinez and Lieutenant Commander Henderson became a case study in military leadership programs across all branches of service. It was cited in training materials, discussed in ethics classes, and referenced in policy documents about civilian relations. But perhaps more importantly, it became a reminder that true leadership often involves standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that the highest-ranking officers in the military are still servants first, servants to their personnel, to their mission, and to the values that define military service. Mrs. Dorothy Chun received a personal letter from the Secretary of the Navy, thanking her for her family's service and apologizing for her treatment at the base. Her grandson, Petty Officer Michael Chun, was eventually promoted ahead of schedule and became one of the youngest communications specialists to receive a commendation for excellence in his field. And Ensign Rodriguez, whose moral courage had impressed Admiral Martinez, found himself selected for accelerated promotion and leadership training. His willingness to speak up when he saw something wrong had demonstrated exactly the kind of character the Navy needed in its future officers. The incidents serve as a powerful reminder that respect and dignity are not luxuries to be granted when convenient, but fundamental requirements of professional conduct. It showed that accountability must flow in all directions, and that the true measure of military leadership is not the ability to command, but the willingness to serve.